Hi there, my name is Katie Worthing. I'm the Executive Director of the Yarmouth History Center. Welcome to Yarmouth's Main Street Then and Now. We're going to take a look at some photos of Yarmouth Main Street over the years, and it'll be almost like a walking tour as we walk up and down both sides of Main Street. We'll look at some historic views of Main Street from the 19th century and early 20th century and compare them with more recent views. In some cases, we'll see some really interesting areas of change. In other places, we will notice just how much has stayed consistent over the years. Just to set the stage, here's a map of Yarmouth from 1857. And looking at it, you can really see the ways that Yarmouth Village was established over the years from the early 19th century into the 20th century. The lower village, clustered around the harbor, sometimes called Falls Village, would have been centered around the shipbuilding industry in the 19th century. And then the upper village, sometimes called Corner Village or Yarmouthville, would have been more associated with the railroad, with the mills, and that's really centered around the corner of Maine and Elm Street. Interestingly, each little village cluster had its own set of stores, businesses, so if you lived in one section of town, you probably did all of your shopping in that area historically, as opposed to traveling to the other end of town for something that you might already have in the neighborhood around you. So it really is like two little mini villages within the larger Yarmouth village. Over the years, that changed as the center started to become more developed between these two. So we'll take a look at what that meant for people as we move into the 20th century. Our first view is a look down Marina Road and Main Street. Marina Road on the right, Main Street on the left here in this view from 1905. In the center of the photo is the Hose Number 2 building that was built for the Royal River Hose Company Number 2 in 1899. That was a structure for the Yarmouth Fire Department. Eventually it was taken over by the town fire department and used by them well into the 20th century. Here's our more current view of this place, looking at the Hose building as it stands or as it stood in 2014. A great example of a great reuse of a historic building, repurposed for offices while still retaining a lot of its historic features. You still can look at this building and understand its history as a fire barn. We're now in the center of Falls Village, or Lower Village, at the corner of Portland Street and Main Street. In the view on the right, you can see in the more current view, Goff's Hardware. Obviously, things have changed there in the years since this photo was taken. We've seen more updates and changes to that building. But comparing it to the image on the left, you'll see that a lot of the houses across the street have really maintained their historic character. So this area of the Falls Village is really carries a lot of consistency with its past history. Here's another view of the Goff's Corner near Portland Street, and I really love this comparison. We've got a 1920s view on the top, a 2014 view on the bottom, and you can just see the consistency of the Goff's structure. But I love the comparison because you can see the dirt road that we had in Main Street in 1920. You can see the fairly new electric lines that were put in the 1890s. Another thing to notice there are the trolley tracks running up and down Main Street. We'll see more of this, of course, as we go through the rest of the photos in the slideshow, but trolley service came to Yarmouth at the end of the 19th century, and it connected Yarmouth to Portland, to Freeport, Brunswick, and it was a really well-utilized service right up until the early 1930s when it was closed down. This view of the Universalist Church on Main Street was taken when the church was still fairly new. This is an 1875 view. The church had been built in 1860, and originally it was called the Central Parish Church, and it was built by members of First Parish Congregational Church who had split from the original congregation over some philosophical differences. And it was designed by Thomas Holt, a Maine architect, in the Italianate style. So looking at the church, if you spot things like the brackets lining the eaves, the elegant rounded arches, the bell tower, all of these are pulled from Italian architecture and were very fashionable stylistic choices for the mid-19th century. So this was right on the cutting edge of design. It was used by the members of the Central Parish until the 1880s, when it was then taken over by the Universalist Church. The original members of that split parish eventually merged back into the Maine First Parish Church. This building is listed in the National Register of Historic Places and is a beautiful landmark on Main Street. And here's a more contemporary view of the Universalist Church. It really gives you a great sense of those architectural details that I mentioned, the brackets, the rounded arches, the symmetry that's expressed in this facade. Across the street now, at the other corner of Main and Portland Street, we're looking at a real anchor that has sat unchanged largely for many years. This is the brick store. We're looking at a view from the late 19th century on the top and a 2014 view on the bottom. Interestingly, the view on the top is actually a picture from one of the first firemen's musters that the town put together to celebrate the opening of the water system in the 1890s. And of course, this is a tradition that had its origins in the 19th century, but has been pulled into the Clam Festival and has been a part of Yarmouth's summer celebrations ever since. Notice the consistency in the building. That brick store, which was built by Ami Storer and used as a business, it was a pharmacy for many years, has really always anchored that corner and has largely remained unchanged in the intervening years. Another view of the corner, again showing the comparison of the brick store around 1875 and the brick store around 2014. And I love to use this comparison, especially with students, because there's so many comparisons and contrasts that you can pull out of this. For one thing, notice the consistency, of course, in the architecture, the brick building, the steeple of First Parish behind it. A great comparison exists in the contrast in transportation. We have the horse and carriage in the image on the left, the car in the image on the right. The street, of course, has changed a lot from dirt to pavement that we have now. And then another thing to note are the street trees. Yarmouth was famous for its beautiful elms lining its main street. Those, of course, succumbed to Dutch elm disease in the 20th century, but we still have a beautiful array of street trees lining Main Street. Moving along Main Street now, we're looking at First Parish Congregational Church. We have a view from 1875 on the left, a view from 2014 on the right. This is actually the third church built by the congregation of First Parish. Their original church, when Yarmouth was first established, was actually closer to the intersection of Route 88 and Gilman Road. That church was called the Meeting House Under the Ledge, and it was used for decades. But as the focus of the town shifted away from Gilman Road and towards the Main Street orientation that we know now, the church built a second church on Main Street near the corner of Main and Bridge Street. We'll see that in a minute. And then when that was outgrown in the 1860s, this church was constructed in 1868. And this is the church, of course, that we have today. This is another example of Italianate architecture. And it's a little bit later than the Central Parish Church across the street and a little bit more flamboyant. You'll see a lot more bracketing, architectural details lining the windows, just to kind of level up from the Central Parish Church, a little bit more grand and expressive than the more restrained style we saw in 1860. This church, too, is on the register, the National Register of Historic Places, and is a great contrast and complement to the Central Parish Church across the street. These are really anchors for the lower village. As promised, here's that second church building that the congregation of First Parish used. This was called the Old Sloop Church. It was built in 1818, right at the corner of Bridge and Main Street, and used by the congregation until the 1860s when they moved into the current First Parish Church. For about a decade after the church left this building, it was used as a meeting hall and a gathering place for the community. It was torn down in 1878. After the Old Sloop Church was torn down, a house was built to take its place. This is L.L. Shaw's house. He was involved with the ownership and management of the Royal River Manufacturing Company. That's currently called the Sparhawk Mill on Bridge Street. And so his house was conveniently located for that work, just at the corner of Bridge and Main Street. This house burned down in the 20th century. And in the next slide, you'll see today it's an office building. Here's the corner of Bridge and Main Street today. It is, as I mentioned, an office building now, the site of an office building. And this is one area that has really seen some changes over the years. We've seen In the slides we've looked at so far, a lot of consistency in the churches, the brick store, but this corner has seen some changes from the old sloop church to L.L. Shaw's house and now to a retail commercial office space. Looking at the other corner of Main and Bridge Street, we come to North Yarmouth Academy. These are the two oldest structures on the campus, Russell Hall and Academy Hall. NYA had been incorporated in 1814, and a few things are different between now and then. Of course, in 1814, Maine was still part of Massachusetts, and the town was actually called North Yarmouth, which is why the academy took that name instead of just Yarmouth. The town of North Yarmouth had been established in 1680 and included all of the modern-day towns of Yarmouth, North Yarmouth, Cumberland, Pownal, Freeport, and parts of Brunswick and Harpswell. And over the years, the towns gradually split off into the current arrangement that we know today. North Yarmouth and Yarmouth didn't split until 1849, so the town, of course, was still called North Yarmouth when the academy was established. These two buildings, as I mentioned, are the oldest on campus. They replaced earlier wooden structures. These are brick, much more long-lasting. Both of these buildings reflect a very clear Greek Revival academic style. You can see the front facades are modeled after Greek temples with the strong triangular pediment at the top, and there are built-in brick details that emulate columns in the front. These buildings were used as classrooms, as dormitory, and both of them are now listed in the National Register of Historic Places. Some interesting developments have happened through the years across the street from the original buildings of NYA. Now, of course, we have the Curtis building, and a view of that is shown on the right. That building was built in the 1930s as the school grew and contains an auditorium, a gymnasium, and now I think we really think of that as the heart of campus. Interestingly, though, years ago, back in the 19th century, a teacher at North Yarmouth Academy, George Woods, had left the school and built his own school on his own family property in that area across the street where the Curtis building now stands. George Woods' academy was meant as a direct competitor to NYA. He had great aspirations for it, but it didn't really pan out, and the school closed just a couple years after Woods had established it. The building that you see on the left was the Woods Academy building. It was repurposed, used as a gym, as a meeting place, moved a couple times through the years, and eventually torn down when North Yarmouth Academy built the Curtis building in 1930. As we move down Main Street towards where the Route 1 bridge crosses Main Street, we're moving into an area of town called Brickyard Hollow. And if you think back to that map I showed at the beginning of the slideshow, you can picture that empty area between the two mini villages that developed over time. And that's Brickyard Hollow. That empty area is Brickyard Hollow. So named because there were brickyards in the area, there were clay deposits, and it wasn't really utilized as a center for any kind of construction because it was quite prone to flooding. So it took a number of years before the town was able to kind of reclaim that land. They filled it in pretty significantly with waste from the Forest Paper Company, that we'll talk about it in a little while, and that helped alleviate the flooding somewhat. And so as we move into the 20th century, we start to see development happening in Brickyard Hollow. Including the comparison here, the view from 1945 shows the post office, that's currently a key bank. There was also a little bank attached to that post office. Next to the post office, off to the left, you can see the building that started out as the Knights of Pythias Hall was repurposed as a Yarmouth movie theater and then later became a hardware store. It was eventually torn down to make way for the parking lot at the NYA Middle School. Merrill Memorial Library was built in 1904 as the town reclaimed area in Brickyard Hollow. This was a gift to the town of Yarmouth from Joseph Merrill, who wished to construct a library for the town. Previous to that, the town's library had been held in the Meeting House on Hillside Street, and before that, it was held in individual town community members' houses. So this brought all of the books collected for the town into one central space. The library itself was designed by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's nephew, Alexander, And you can see in the comparison here, the postcard view from 1910 very much matches the view that we currently have of the library. Even though it's expanded over the years, it has really maintained fidelity to its original design, and really it still maintains a lot of those historic features. Here are a couple of wider views of Brickyard Hollow, looking down Main Street towards the library. In the upper view from about 1906, you can see the library clearly there on the left. Behind it is the Masonic Hall, which now houses Gather. Our view on the bottom view is obscured by the presence of the Route 1 overpass bridge, so we don't have quite a clear view past the library to Gather at that point. Another comparison to note in this is the trolley tracks running down Main Street. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. The trolley served Yarmouth, connected it to a variety of other local towns, and there was a waiting room on Main Street where you could catch the trolley into Portland or head into Freeport. As Brickyard Hollow was reclaimed by the town, townspeople eventually saw great value in constructing central schools there. So the image on the top from about 1905 shows two of those central school buildings. The town had about 9 one-room school districts, and those were still used as schools for the lower grades. But the building on the right in the upper image was built around 1890 to house the upper grades. So grade 5 through 8 were housed on the first floor, and then high school students were housed on the second floor. The town very quickly outgrew this school, and only about a decade later, around 1900, a separate high school was built, and that's the building that you see on the left. That was used by the town's high school students until 1930, when the decision was made to send all Yarmouth high school students to North Yarmouth Academy. And that was the case until the early 1960s, when the current Yarmouth High School was built. The two school buildings that we see in that upper image were used well into the 20th century and were eventually torn down as Yarmouth prepared to build the town hall on the site in the 1970s. One thing to note in the upper slide too is the memorial bandstand, which was built as a memorial to Yarmouth's war veterans. Also on Main Street, but set back from the street view, is Camp Hammond, which was built for George Hammond in around 1889-1890. George Hammond was the part owner and manager of the Forest Paper Company, which sat where today's Royal River Park is, and it was a soda pulp mill making a high-quality pulp for use in the paper-making industry. George Hammond was generally based in Boston, but wanted a place where he could come and observe the workings of his mill when he was in Yarmouth, and so he had Camp Hammond built. It generally served as a summer home, which is why it's called camp. And he took an interesting technique when he had this place built. He employed a special technique called a mill-built construction process that ensured that the building, if it ever were to catch fire, would burn very slowly and so enable the fire department to catch up with the flames and put the flames out. So this is something that Hammond learned from his experience in the mills and applied to his own house. It's a beautiful shingle-style house, again, set back from Main Street. It's painted red, and it was designed both with some very beautiful gardens and grounds and a view of the factory in the back. So in this photo, you can see just off to the left and behind the house some of the smokestacks of the Forest Paper Company. So George Hammond could enjoy both a great landscape in front of his house, a convenient location in Yarmouth, and a very clear view of the workings in his factory behind the house. Here are a couple of photos showing the extent of the Forest Paper Company. This sat in today's Royal River Park at the third falls of the Royal River. When you're walking through the park, you can still see some of the ruins of the factory on both sides of the river. And at its height, this became the largest soda pulp mill of its type in the world. It employed about 250 people when it was at its busiest and ran operations 24 hours a day. And you can just see in the top photo the piles of poplar wood waiting to be loaded into the digesters to be transformed into wood pulp, and then below the extent of the factory covering both sides of the river and really involving the entire site. It was a massive operation. And here's Camp Hammond today. In 2014, Currently, this building serves as the headquarters of the Black Tie Catering Company. It's an event venue and has a lot of original features still preserved inside, including a fabulous fireplace and a lot of original woodwork. Railroads came to Yarmouth in the 1840s, with the St. Lawrence and Atlantic, later the Grand Trunk Railroad, arriving in 1848, and the Kennebec and Portland, later the Maine Central, arriving in 1849. The two lines crossed just outside of Yarmouth at Yarmouth Junction. The main line that runs across Main Street is the Grand Trunk line. The station for that, this iconic train station that really defines Main Street in Yarmouth, was built in 1906, replacing an earlier station that had served for the decades prior to that. The station continued to service passengers on the Grand Trunk lines in Yarmouth until gradually rail service faded. The building was threatened with demolition in the 1960s, but was saved by the Village Improvement Society, who performed needed upgrades, preserving the architectural elements that really make this building special, including its beautiful curved roof line and really distinctive shape. The building is currently home to Gorham Savings Bank and has been listed in the National Register of Historic Places. The Village Improvement Society was instrumental in preserving the Grand Trunk Depot in the 1960s, but decades prior to that, they actually took on their first project just outside that train station at the Village Green Park in the 19-teens. They viewed this park as an opportunity to really present Yarmouth in the best light possible to any visiting passengers or people passing through town, and so wanted to make sure the park presented a really positive moment for visitors to Yarmouth. So they took on the rehabilitation of the park. It was designed by Carl Rust Parker, who was a member of Frederick Law Olmsted's landscape architecture firm. And you can see in the comparison here, the Village Green Park in 1925, a decade or so after its initial establishment, and the view today. The park has recently undergone more upgrades in the last couple of years and really still carries out the Village Improvement Society's interest in creating a welcoming point for the town. When the railroads arrived in Yarmouth in the late 1840s, a great burst of interest in land speculation occurred. People were investing in the town, thinking that the railroads would be a great driver of tourism, of travel, of industry. And so we see things like the Yarmouth Hotel, which was built just across from the railroad station. It had a number of different names over the years, had a number of different owners, but was intended to be a grand entry point to Yarmouth for travelers. The hotel was built with a two-story balcony, which you can see in this photo from 1900. It also had a grand ballroom and even bowling alleys in the basement. Business at the hotel never really materialized in the way its owners had hoped. The hotel burned down in the late 1920s, but the barn was repurposed and moved and eventually became home to the Yarmouth Grange, and that's the view you see in this photo here. And the Grange gave way to the view pictured here, which is the gas station on Main Street. So this is the site of the Yarmouth Hotel, the Grange, and now the gas station, another area where we see some significant changes in Yarmouth over time. We're crossing the railroad tracks now and working our way into the Upper Village, also known as Yarmouthville, Corner Village. This area of town was much more associated with the railroads, with the mill industries growing up around it, and even had its own post office to distinguish it from the lower village that also had its own post office. So they really were distinct sides of town. We're looking at here on the left a view of Coombs Confectionery, and the right, the way those buildings have evolved into the present time. The next few slides are going to cover some of the businesses that called these buildings headquarters over time, and we'll take a look at how the building has changed. The Coombs brothers started in the confectionery business fairly small scale at first, with a cart where they sold lemonade and molasses candy to shipyard workers, but eventually worked their way up into a headquarters in this building, right next to the railroad tracks. And the sign you see on this building currently resides at the History Center, so we have it on display at our building. But from the early cart selling lemonade and molasses candies, the Coombs brothers grew into a very popular business. They made their own ice cream and a variety of other candies right on Main Street. And gradually, as you can see here, the business expanded So with this view, they've combined the two buildings at the corner by the railroad tracks into one. There's a little connector that connects the two, and they've started to wrap the building in further advertisements for the business. The Coombs Confectionery Building was eventually occupied by Rings Hardware, which is the view you see here from 1975 on the left. And today, as you see in the photo on the right, serves a variety of businesses and offices. The Catholic Church came to Main Street in 1910. You can see it here in this view from about 1911 in the barn back behind Captain Eben York's house. The church was held in the barn until 1913 when the barn burned down. The stone church that currently stands on Main Street was then built next door to Captain Eben York's mansion, which became the rectory. Prior to its relocation to Main Street, the church had been located on Cumberland Street. And here's the church as it stands today. It was built in the early 1920s out of local stone. The house at 317 Main Street was built in 1855 by Captain Sylvanus C. Blanchard. He hired architect Charles Alexander to design this elegant Italianate house, high style, on Main Street for the Blanchard family. We can see the Italianate details in the heavy bracketing underneath the eaves, the arches, the attached side porches, and the cupola at the top. This building, now used as 317 Main Community Music Center, is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. As it stands today, the house at 317 Main still preserves and maintains many of its historic elements that make it a great example of the Italianate style. Baptists came to Main Street and moved into this church designed by noted architect John Calvin Stevens in 1889. Previously, they had met at the old meeting house on Hillside Street, where they had met since the 1790s. The church on Main Street was designed in very beautiful shingle style with its asymmetrical facade, the curved front wall, the porch, the bell tower, all of them really interesting elements. The clock was installed to chime its first hour on New Year's Day, 1900. And here's the church in 2014. It's expanded and grown over the years, but still maintains its historic front facade on Main Street. Many of the commercial buildings in the Upper Village are still intact. In this comparison, the view from the early 20th century above and the view from 2014 below show the continuity in those structures. Anchoring the commercial buildings in the Upper Village is the brick block, built in 1862. In this view here, you can see out front the Liberty Elm, which served as a community bulletin board. You can see the bulletin board on it where people would post news and notes about happenings in town. Also, this photo, taken around 1900, seems to have been taken around Independence Day as the building is decked out with 4th of July bunting and flags. The businesses in this building, we have L.R. Cook's Apothecary on the right and Marston's Dry Goods Store on the left. Marston's is an interesting case. They opened in the mid-19th century and closed in the 1960s, meaning that they were in business for about 100 years. And here's the brick block in 2014, really maintaining a great consistency in its front facade. This slide and the next have a great comparison of earlier views and more current views. Here we have a view on the top from 1895 and a view from 2014 below. You can see the brick block anchoring both of those views. Buildings around them have changed somewhat, but you still get a sense of the small village-style commercial architecture that really define this part of town. One thing to note, of course, the beautiful elm trees visible in the upper image have been replaced by a greater variety of street trees in the lower image. Another comparison here from the 1940s above to 2014 below, really sharing a similar feel of the village character that we've been seeing right along. Now we're at the corner of Main Street and East Elm Street, where about 30 different businesses have called home over the years. In the 1890s, the Foster Pottery was torn down, and eventually this corner was home to the Storer Brothers hardware store, which we see in this photo. Storer Brothers was located on this corner from 1906 until 1935. In 1935, Storer Brothers gave way to a more familiar business, Andy's Handy Store, which was located on this corner from 1935 onwards. Andy's expanded and changed over the years. This view is from 2014. And it has continued to change, as we see in this view from 2015. Now we're at the corner of West Main and West Elm Street. In the upper view from the early 20th century, we see the Dunn House, which in previous decades, back in the 19th century, had actually served as a stagecoach stop and tavern. After it was torn down in the 1950s, it was home to the Texaco station you can see in the view below from 1972. In the next slide, we'll see what's on this site now. This site, the corner of West Main and West Elm Street, is now home to Latchstring Park, which was named after the award that honors local Yarmouth citizens that are involved community members and volunteers. Our last stop on this tour of Main Street brings us to the intersection of West Main and Sligo Road, where we have in the upper view from about 1910 a photo of the Town Hall and brick schools. The Town Hall was on this site from 1833 until 1910, and it was at this Town Hall that the vote to split the town from North Yarmouth was undertaken in 1849. Apparently the crowd was so large that they had to wrap it around outside onto the street. The Town Hall was torn down in 1910. After that point, the meeting house on Hillside Street was used for town meetings, and eventually the current Town Hall was built in the 1970s. The brick schools that you see just to the left of the Town Hall still stand. They were built in the 1840s and used as schoolhouses for many, many years and are now currently used as business offices. And that's the view we have in the photo below from 2014. That wraps up our Main Street Then and Now tour. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us at the History Center, 846-6259, or drop me an email, info@yarmouthmehistory.org. Thank you.